The first sign was so subtle most would have missed it: a new crack in the concrete path behind my house. Not wide, not deep. But I'd walked that path every day for the past 7 years, and I knew every inch of it like the back of my hand. That tiny fracture felt like a whisper from the earth, one that said, "I'm shifting." I'm not the kind of man who panics easily. I spent 22 years in the military as an engineer overseeing terrain logistics and damage mitigation in places where the earth moved far more violently than here in rural Washington. I've seen entire hillsides swallow roads in Afghanistan, watched mudslides wash out supply routes in Colombia. So when I noticed that crack, I didn't think coincidence, I thought warning. Our neighborhood Sycamore Ridge is perched between two hills, with old forested slopes cradling our winding cul-de-sacs like arms around a child. It's a beautiful place, the kind of quiet suburb where lawnmowers hum on Saturdays and every house looks like it belongs on a real estate flyer. But beneath the curated charm lies something HOA brochures never mention: unstable ground. When I bought the place after retiring, I asked the realtor about soil history. She waved it off, said the hillside had been fine for decades. But I dug up the geological survey anyway, literally. Hired a private team to analyze the grade behind my property. What they found wasn't reassuring: deep veins of clay and decomposed granite prone to liquefaction under prolonged rain. The kind of stuff that turns to soup under stress. So I built strategically, reinforced my foundation, installed retaining walls that weren't cheap, but I wasn't taking chances. My daughter Haley was only 14 then, fresh off losing her mom to cancer. I wasn't going to risk losing anything else. 7 years passed without incident, until this past winter. It started with early rains, more than usual. October dumped buckets. November didn't stop. By the time December rolled around, the ground behind my house squelched when you walked on it, like wet bread. Scout, my old German Shepherd, wouldn't even step off the porch without hesitation. And that's when I noticed more signs. A leaning tree that used to stand straight, a section of the fence that suddenly dipped, and water pooling in places it never had before. I took pictures, marked locations, measured the angle of slope changes. It wasn't just intuition anymore, it was data. The slope was moving. I brought it up at the HOA's monthly meeting. They gave me the floor for 2 minutes, just long enough for me to be polite, professional, and still feel like I was talking to drywall. "Thank you for your input, Mr. Coulter," the HOA president, Randall Gibbs, said with that forced smile he always wore, like a real estate agent about to deny your loan. "But our engineers have reviewed the area and see no imminent concerns. The construction project is safe to proceed." Construction. That was the real reason they didn't want to hear me. The HOA had pushed through a plan to pave a new community event area. At the base of the slope, a concrete pad, picnic benches, and additional parking spots. It was ambitious. It was flashy. And it was dangerously located. The site rested directly in the path of the runoff channel I'd charted. Rainfall was carving grooves into the hillside like veins under stretched skin. Every storm etched it deeper. It wasn't a matter of if the hill would fail. It was a matter of when. I sent an official letter. Included my background, my findings, even photos of similar sites I'd worked on in disaster zones. No reply. Days passed. Then came the heavy January storm. It wasn't just rain, it was a deluge. Winds howled. Trees swayed like dancers about to fall. The creek behind my house turned into a brown, roaring snake. I stood on my deck in the dark flashlight, cutting through sheets of rain, and watched as a whole section of brush behind Lot 38 began to sag. The earth there pulsed visibly. I emailed the HOA again that night. Subject: urgent landslide, imminent, near proposed worksite. Attachments, photos, GPS coordinates, slope angles. Message: you are endangering lives. Immediate action is required. Please cancel all site operations until a geotechnical team can reassess stability. The only reply I got was an automated response: "Thank you for contacting the Sycamore Ridge HOA. Your message has been received." The next morning, 3 large flatbed trucks rolled into the site at 7:12 a.m. sharp. From my vantage point, behind my property fence, I watched them unload heavy equipment. A few men in HOA-branded windbreakers, none of them engineers, paced around with clipboards. One of them, Tom Shaver, glanced my way. We made eye contact. He smirked. It was the kind of smirk that said, You're just a homeowner. Stay in your lane. But I'd seen that smirk before, usually right before someone got hurt. I didn't say anything to Haley. She had SAT prep that weekend, and I didn't want to stress her. But that night while she slept, I sat up staring at the slope maps I'd printed out. I circled every danger zone in red ink. Wrote out emergency numbers, packed a go bag. Not for me, for the crews who didn't know what they were walking into. I didn't know exactly when it would happen, but I knew we were running out of time. That ground wasn't just shifting anymore. It was warning us, and no one wanted to listen. 2 days after the trucks rolled in, the ground behind my house dipped by almost 2 inches overnight. I noticed it first thing in the morning while walking Scout along our regular path. He stopped dead in his tracks, ears stiff, nose twitching at something I couldn't smell. When I turned to look, the slope just beyond the trail looked wrong, like it had exhaled too deeply, a subtle hollowing. But to someone trained to read terrain like a map of living nerves, it was clear the hillside was preparing to let go. I took precise measurements, used my laser level, marked the same spots I'd been tracking. The subsidence had accelerated, and still the HOA moved forward with construction like none of it mattered. I printed the data, created a topographic model on my laptop, and compiled it into a PDF. Then I did something I rarely do. I dressed in my old uniform. Not the full military dress, but the tan field shirt with my last rank still stitched in faded thread. I shaved, combed my silvered hair back, and walked into the Sycamore Ridge HOA office like I was reporting for duty again. The office was a converted model home sitting on the eastern side of the neighborhood near the tennis courts. Inside it smelled like printer toner and air freshener, too clean to be comfortable. I was greeted by Lisa, the HOA assistant, a woman in her 30s who always smiled like she was afraid not to. "Mr. Coulter," she said, "do you have an appointment?" "No," I replied, "but I have an urgent geological risk assessment that can't wait." She blinked but didn't stop smiling. "Let me see if Randall is." "I'm going back there, Lisa." I walked past her before she could object. Randall Gibbs was in his office, sitting behind a dark oak desk, sipping from a mug that said "Number 1 Neighborhood Boss." He looked up, clearly annoyed. "Mr. Coulter, you can't just barge in." "I can when lives are on the line," I said, placing the folder on his desk. "You need to stop the site work immediately. That slope is ready to go." He gave a lazy glance at the packet. "I've seen your emails." "Then you know I'm not just guessing. I've included the USGS overlay satellite soil movement tracking from the last 3 months and a 5-year rainfall comparison. This is not a theoretical risk anymore, Randall. This is happening." He flipped the folder closed. "Our hired consultants reviewed the area. It's stable." "What consultants?" He waved vaguely. "We had a firm. Out of Spokane, I think." You think I leaned forward, eyes level with his. Was it a licensed geotech firm or a landscaping contractor with a drone? That got under his skin. He stood up, all 5'8" of smug HOA authority, puffing out his chest. "Look, Coulter, you're not on the board. You have no say. We appreciate your concern, but this constant interference is starting to sound like paranoia. Do you have any idea how much the new event space is going to increase property values? Do you have any idea how many people a landslide will bury alive?" He didn't answer, just stared. "Fine," I said quietly. "But if that hill gives out, and it will, your name will be in every report, and I'll personally testify to your negligence." I left without another word. That night, I heard trucks running until nearly midnight. They were pouring the foundation slab. The next morning, I filed a formal complaint with the city engineering department. I included everything: coordinates, maps, analysis, and a warning about the slope's instability under current rainfall levels. I knew bureaucracy moved slow, but I was hoping for at least a site inspection order. Instead, I got a notice from the HOA stuffed in my mailbox the next day. "Dear Mr. Coulter, this letter serves as a formal reminder that unauthorized dissemination of misinformation or obstruction of approved HOA projects is a violation of your member agreement. Repeated infractions may result in fines and disciplinary action." Misinformation. They had the nerve to call science misinformation. And to threaten me with disciplinary action like this was a kindergarten classroom and I was talking out of turn. I could feel the fire building in my gut. Not just anger, but dread. A slow seeping realization that I was dealing with people who valued power more than responsibility, optics more than truth. And if the cost of their image was safety, they'd pay it gladly. I spent the next few days doing the only thing I could, watching the hillside. Scout and I walked the fence line every morning and evening. The soil was swelling. Roots bulged like veins pushing against the topsoil. There were new fractures in the ground, some running like veins through the earth, hairline cracks that widened after every storm. Then came the neighbor. She lived 3 doors down, Eileen Marks, mid-50s, single, a retired nurse who always wore a wide straw hat. She waved me down one morning. "Ray, what's going on with that hill?" I looked at her. "You noticed." She nodded, frowning. "My basement walls showing hairline cracks. I've lived here 15 years and never seen that before." I told her everything. She didn't laugh. She didn't wave it off. She listened. And then she did something unexpected. She called her nephew, a local reporter. By the following evening, there was a small story on a local blog. Sycamore Ridge, HOA ignores landslide warnings, continues construction. It didn't get much traction at first, but it lit a fuse. The HOA sent out an emergency email the next morning, accusing certain residents of trying to sabotage community unity with unverified geological alarmism. They called for civil cooperation and trust. I could almost hear Randall writing it in his silk tie, sipping coffee from his idiot mug. Meanwhile, the rain kept falling. 3 inches in 24 hours. Then another storm stacked right behind it, and the soil reached saturation. I checked the slope angle one more time, and what I saw chilled me. It had reached the failure threshold. It was going to happen. And nothing, no email, no data, no uniform, no conversation could stop it now. I had done everything I could. The rest was up to the hill. I don't know who originally came up with the idea. But somewhere between HOA meetings filled with stale coffee and forced smiles, someone pitched the plan to transform the slopeside clearing into a community gathering space. A gleaming concrete slab, decorative benches, covered picnic shelters, LED lampposts, maybe even a little amphitheater if the budget stretched. It was the kind of thing that would look good in a flyer. Another checkmark for their real estate bullet list. Modern HOA with outdoor event facilities. But to build it, they needed access, and that meant trucks, rollers, diggers, and reinforced cement. And all of it had to cross directly through what I'd been warning them about for weeks, a hillside ready to let go. Randall Gibbs, of course, was at the heart of it. President of the board for 5 consecutive years. Former used car dealership owner turned self-proclaimed neighborhood visionary. A man who'd never met a microphone he didn't like, or a complaint he couldn't belittle. Randall saw this construction project as his legacy, a permanent monument to his tenure. "Imagine neighborhood movie nights under the stars," he said during the January meeting just days before the worst storm hit. "Food trucks lining the edge, kids playing while parents relax. It's about building community. People." I stood up, took the microphone, and calmly explained that the slope they planned to develop had 2 underground seepage channels mapped by USGS back in 2011, channels that under prolonged rainfall could turn the entire hillside into a river of mud. He waved his hand like he was swatting a fly. "Let's not give in to doomsday talk," he chuckled. "This isn't a war zone, Ray. It's a neighborhood." That drew some laughter from the crowd. A few people clapped. Others just looked uncomfortable. I sat down, quiet, seething. They'd voted that night. Unanimous approval, 7-0. Shovels hit the ground the following Monday. Within days, the HOA newsletter was blasting out glossy digital renders of the future site. They even had a name picked out, Sycamore Commons. There were pastel sketches of smiling families on tidy benches, dogs on leashes, and fairy lights strung between poles. It looked like a Hallmark movie. It was a damn death trap. The trucks started arriving in waves. Flatbeds stacked with rebar, cement mixers grinding like lazy monsters. On the 4th day of construction, I counted 18 different vehicles going in and out of the area. They flattened the upper slope and brought in filled dirt, for God's sake. Uncompacted high-moisture content, the worst kind of base for a grade like that. I recognized a few of the workers. Not a single one was geotech certified. They were general laborers, subcontracted out from a landscaping company that specialized in backyard patios. I stood outside my fence and watched one of them operating a bobcat at the edge of a visibly cracked berm. I whistled to get his attention. "You're about 10 feet from a shear line," I said. He just looked at me, blinked, and went back to work. The next day, I got another notice from the HOA. This one threatened fines if I continued to interfere with authorized development or approached contracted workers on site. They cited Clause 3.2 of the HOA Charter, a rule originally meant to prevent harassment during pool maintenance. That night, I sat in my garage, the door open to the cold air. Scout lay beside me, head on his paws, watching as I stared at the slope behind the house. I knew what was coming. I'd seen it too many times before earth that looks still but isn't ground that deceives. Landslides don't start with thunder. They start with whispers. On a deployment in Peru, I once watched a village lose 40 homes in 3 minutes. They'd ignored the same warnings. And when the rain came, the mountain didn't ask permission. So I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I called in a favor. My old colleague Sarah Malone now worked with the county's emergency planning department. We'd built temporary shelters together during flood season in Nebraska a decade earlier. She picked up on the third ring. "Ray Coulter," she said, laughing. "Haven't heard your voice since you out-argued a colonel into approving 400 sandbags." "Sarah," I said, "I need eyes on a site, quietly, fast." I gave her everything: coordinates, pictures, elevation shifts, soil data. She promised to get a look but warned me that it might take days. Red tape, priorities, no guarantees. Meanwhile, the HOA posted updates online bragging about swift progress and community pride. Photos of board members in hard hats holding shovels and smiling like pageant winners. Randall in the center always. They even planned a small ceremony. Construction milestone, celebration, coffee and donuts on site, the flyer read. Scheduled for Saturday. Rain was forecast all weekend. I couldn't sleep. Thursday night, I sat in my truck with the engine off, watching the dark outlines of machinery parked against the slope. The clouds hung heavy above the ridge. Everything smelled wet, heavy, tense. Friday morning, I drove into town to get groceries, and when I came back, I found that they'd poured another slab. I could see the sheen of still-drying cement just beyond the tree line. But something else caught my eye. One of the older trees near the slope, the one I'd been using as a marker, was tilting. It had leaned a bit over the last week, but now it was different. Sharper. Fresh cracks formed around the base. I got out and walked up, boots sinking into soft, saturated soil. The whole hill had shifted overnight. Again. I snapped photos, sent them to Sarah. She replied a few hours later, "This is bad. Sending to Geotech. Will escalate if they confirm movement." At 9:04 p.m. that night, I received a second email from the county soil engineer. 2 lines. Significant shear risk confirmed. Recommend immediate cessation of site activity pending investigation. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I forwarded the message to the HOA, marked it urgent, and went to bed, wondering if they'd bother to read it before the hill answered for me. They called it a special session, but it felt more like a last-minute scramble to protect their own hides. The email arrived at 6:47 a.m. Saturday morning. The same morning they were supposed to host their construction milestone celebration on the work site. Instead, it read, Subject: Urgent HOA meeting, attendance requested. Location: Sycamore Ridge Clubhouse. Time: 9:00 a.m. Topic: Response to safety concerns and construction review. No apology. No acknowledgement of the prior emails I'd sent. Just a sterile, perfunctory subject line. But I showed up anyway. I had to. I needed it on the record, and frankly, I wanted to look them in the eye when this all came crashing down, figuratively or literally. The clubhouse was already filling when I arrived. At least 30 homeowners packed the small space folding chairs. The smell of burnt coffee and styrofoam cups, and the low murmur of voices stirred by something deeper than HOA routine. The rain had returned overnight, a slow-soaking drizzle that clung to everyone's jackets and fogged the windows. You could feel the weight of the weather in the room. I spotted Randall at the front, flanked by the rest of the board's 7 members in matching navy vests, with the HOA logo stitched over the left chest. They looked like a scout troop for bureaucrats. His wife, Dana, was taking notes with a tight-lipped expression. Tom Shaver, the vice president, was leaning back in his chair with that smirk he always wore when he thought someone was about to get verbally steamrolled. They opened the floor with vague statements about community resilience, project transparency, and how rumors should not dictate progress. I waited. Let them finish their prepared statements. Then Randall looked up, his voice a little thinner than usual. "We understand that Mr. Coulter has raised concerns and would like to address them in front of the board." I stood. "I submitted certified data from a licensed county geotechnical engineer yesterday," I said, holding up a copy of the report. "It confirms slope instability at the current worksite. If construction continues, the HOA could be held liable for any injuries or damages resulting from a collapse." Randall held up his hand. "Ray, with all due respect." "No," I said, "not this time." I stepped forward, calm but deliberate. The room hushed. "I served 22 years in terrain operations for the U.S. Army. I've responded to landslides that buried entire towns. I'm telling you as plainly as I can, that hill is saturated. There is active shearing. You are endangering people's lives." Tom leaned forward. "Is there any actual evidence of movement?" I held up my phone, connected it to the projector, and pulled up a time-lapse of the last 5 days I'd recorded from my backyard trail cam. Click. A tree sagging visibly with each rainfall. Click. A crack along the slope widening from less than a centimeter to over an inch. Click. The cement pad itself developing a hairline fracture running directly across its center. The room shifted literally. People leaned forward. A few gasped. I paused, then brought up the county email and read it aloud. "Significant shear risk confirmed. Recommend immediate cessation of site activity pending investigation." Randall's jaw twitched. He turned to Dana, who just nodded faintly and kept writing. Tom still looked like he was itching to interrupt. "So what do you propose we do?" Randall finally asked. "Just halt all progress and let the mud win." "No," I said, "I propose you act like leaders and listen to the damn land before it swallows someone." A woman in the second row stood, Eileen Marks. She looked directly at the board. "My foundation is cracking. I called a contractor and he said the pressure's coming from the hill. You ignored him. You ignored Ray. What if I lose my home?" That broke the tension wide open. Others joined in. A man named Tony from Lot 12 said his fence post collapsed into a sinkhole just yesterday. Another, Julia from the East cul-de-sac, said she saw the worksite crew pumping water out in the middle of the night. The questions started flying. Yes, why haven't we seen a third-party geotech report? Who approved the contractor? Why wasn't this discussed with homeowners? Randall tried to regain control, but the tide had turned. His voice faltered. Dana whispered something and he sat down, lips pressed tight. Then Tom stood up and pointed at me. "Ray's been trying to sabotage this project from the start. He hates progress. He's exaggerating to kill our investment." I didn't flinch. "I'm trying to keep people alive," I said. "If you think that's sabotage, you don't belong in charge of anything but a lawnmower." The room went silent. Then, unexpectedly, a soft voice from the back. "What happens if it slides today?" All eyes turned to an elderly man with a cane, Mr. Hendricks, a Korean War vet who'd lived here longer than anyone else. I took a breath. "If it slides today, and anyone is near the worksite," I said, "they may not walk away." The room went cold. Randall cleared his throat and announced a temporary work stoppage until the county could inspect the site. A forced move, clearly designed to save face, but it bought us time. I stayed after the meeting. People I'd never spoken to before came up and shook my hand. Eileen hugged me. Others simply nodded, no words necessary. But deep down I knew it wasn't over. Not yet. Because rain was still falling outside. Quiet, steady, relentless. And the ground was still waiting. That night I barely slept. The rain hadn't let up since dusk. It wasn't the kind of dramatic thunderstorm that roars through and leaves its damage in a blaze of noise. This was worse, a slow soaking drizzle that fell with the patience of erosion itself. It sank deep, pressing down inch by inch into a hillside already gasping under the weight. I sat by the window, arms crossed, Scout lying at my feet, with his ears twitching toward the sliding door that faced the slope. Every so often, he would lift his head, growl low, then set it back down. We'd both seen too much to ignore instinct. I checked the trail camera footage again. At 11:48 p.m., the tilt of the leaning alder shifted by half a degree. Most people would never notice, but I'd calibrated that camera to detect precisely that kind of micro-movement. The tree was no longer holding, it was being held, by roots on borrowed time. Down the hill, the worksite lights still glowed through the tree's muted halos behind the fogged rain. The crew hadn't returned after the emergency meeting, but they'd left behind their machinery. 2 flatbeds, a backhoe. One of the mixers had been left half covered with a tarp that now sagged under the pooling rain. The cement slab they poured 3 days ago had cracked further, now visibly spidering toward the northeast edge right along the old runoff channel I had marked on my maps. I texted Sarah Malone at the County Emergency Planning Office. Me. Soil movement confirmed. Risk level. She replied 6 minutes later. Sarah, we're seeing unstable subsurface saturation in your sector. Technically, still within watch, but if tonight's rainfall continues, we'll upgrade to imminent. Imminent. That word hit harder than I expected. I stared out at the trees at the ridgeline, partially obscured by mist and darkness. Somewhere out there, a slope was holding on by threads. It felt like waiting for a verdict from a judge who never speaks, just acts. Haley came downstairs at some point, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Dad, she whispered. I turned. Sorry, did I wake you? She shook her head. I couldn't sleep either. Scout keeps pacing. I glanced at the dog. He was at the door now, staring through the glass with a kind of animal stillness that means something's coming. Haley walked over and joined me at the window. Is it going to happen? She asked. I didn't answer right away. She had grown up with me pointing out fault lines on road trips, explaining structural stress during storms, turning every cracked sidewalk into a geology lesson. She knew what the pause in my voice meant. Yes, I said softly. I think it's close. Should we leave? I shook my head. We're uphill. We're safe. But others? I thought of Mr. Hendricks of the young couple on lot 38, whose baby had just started crawling. Of the workers who might show up early the next day thinking the board had things under control. At 2:11 a.m., I sent one more email to the HOA CC'd to the City Council, the emergency office, and the local news desk. Subject: Final warning. Slope collapse likely within 24 hours. Body. This is not alarmism. This is engineering fact. The data supports imminent subsidence. I recommend immediate evacuation of the worksite, suspension of all equipment operations, emergency slope inspections by qualified geotechnical team. Failure to act may result in bodily harm or loss of life. I hit send. Then I printed the same message on paper, signed it, and taped it to the HOA clubhouse door myself in the rain. When I got back home, I packed an emergency bag anyway. Old habits, military reflexes, flashlight, batteries, first aid kit, flares, a whistle. Not for me. For whoever might need it in the morning. And then I sat back down by the window with Scout and Haley beside me, 3 quiet sentinels in the dark, waiting for the earth to speak. It did, just before dawn. There was no thunderclap, no cinematic rumble like in the movies. Only a shift in the air pressure like the inhale before a scream. Then came the sound, deep, low, resonant, like 100 sheets of drywall snapping in unison. I bolted upright. The ground didn't shake, it sighed. Out the window, I saw the ridge behind the site give way. Not all at once, but in a slow, sickening wave, like molasses crawling down a tilted plate. Trees bent, then tore loose. Mud began to move like water, thick and heavy and irreversible. The worksite benches, fencing even part of the unfinished slab, vanished beneath it. And then the screaming started. I didn't understand it at first. Who would be down there? But they were there. 3 HOA board members had come early that morning. Randall, Tom, and Dana. I saw them running, no scrambling through the trees, soaked and panicked, shouting into radios that weren't working. One of the flatbeds began to tilt. The wheels sank into the sludge as it slid sideways and slammed into a retaining wall with a metallic shriek. A tree, an enormous pine, toppled behind it and smashed the cab. Randall stumbled, slipped, and crawled through ankle-deep mud. Tom tried to hold his phone over his head like it would stop the mountain from eating him. Dana screamed as the slope rolled past the corner of the slab and nearly pulled her with it. Randall yanked her back by her coat. I grabbed my jacket boots and go bag. Haley stood behind me, wide-eyed. Stay here, I said. Lock the door. Call 911. Tell them it's a slide active, near Sycamore Ridge site. She nodded, already dialing. I ran. Scout ran beside me. By the time I reached the perimeter trail, the hillside was gone. Where there had once been trees equipment and the future Sycamore Commons, there was now a yawning scar of sludge and destruction. And in the middle of it, 3 mud-soaked HOA board members, eyes wide, drenched in terror, finally understanding what I had been trying to tell them for weeks. The hill had spoken, and it had not whispered this time. By the time emergency sirens echoed through the valley, I was already at the edge of the wreckage. Mud clung to everything. Trees, concrete, clothing, skin. The slope that had once stood tall behind the worksite was now a cratered ruin, a mass of oozing earth and broken trunks, as if a monstrous hand had reached down and scooped out the land. And at the center of it all, Randall, Tom, and Dana. They were a mess. Randall's pristine HOA vest was torn at the shoulder, smeared with mud and pine needles. Dana's hands were shaking uncontrollably. Her ponytail had come loose, her glasses gone, and her knees were scraped raw. Tom was coughing, his face streaked with grime, limping slightly. They looked less like the imperious board that had ignored every warning, and more like children who'd wandered into a battlefield. And in a way they had. They spotted me coming down the hill scout at my side. You, Randall, started, then coughed, bent over, and vomited into the mud. I didn't say a word at first. I took in the wreckage, noted the missing chunk of the newly poured slab, the way the retaining wall had crumbled like crackers under pressure. The machinery was either buried or half-tipped, like discarded toys. The runoff channel I had warned about had become a gouged riverbed, cutting through everything in its path. Tom limped toward me. You sent that warning last night. Why didn't anyone stop us? You stopped yourselves, I said quietly. I've been warning you for 2 weeks. We didn't think, Dana choked. We didn't think it would actually move, I finished. That it would collapse. That the land you flattened and loaded with weight would give way after 12 days of rain. She didn't answer. None of them did. Emergency vehicles began pulling up. First a fire truck, then 2 sheriff's deputies, paramedics. Lights cut through the fog like lances. Radio chatter buzzed into the open air. One of the deputies approached us, hand on his belt, eyeing the site with growing alarm. His boots sank into the edge of the debris field. Who's in charge here, he asked. Randall opened his mouth, but I stepped forward. This area is under HOA development, I said calmly. I'm Ray Coulter. I've submitted multiple geological warnings to the board. The landslide was predicted. I have the report's time-stamped photos and confirmation from the county's emergency planning office. The deputy nodded slowly. Anyone injured? Not seriously, I replied. Shaken, maybe bruised. But the equipment's a total loss, and the slope's still unstable. You'll want to cordon off 100 yards minimum. Secondary failure risk is high. He raised his radio. Dispatch, I need a geotech unit and soil stability team at Sycamore Ridge Development Site. We have a confirmed slide with ongoing ground movement. Paramedics were already tending to Dana and Randall. One EMT wrapped Randall's ankle, another checked Dana's vitals and cleaned a long cut on her cheek. Tom sat on a stump, staring into nothing. A local news van showed up next. They'd seen the 911 scanner report and sent a camera crew. I recognized the anchor, Susan Laramie, who normally covered weekend community events and weather recaps. But today, her heels were coated in mud as she navigated toward the cluster of responders with a cameraman in tow. Can someone confirm what happened here, she asked, voice tight with adrenaline. We're hearing reports of a construction accident linked to a potential landslide. The deputy glanced at me. I nodded. You'll want to talk to the county soil department, I said. But the short version is this development was built against safety recommendations. The land was unstable. It collapsed. And you are Ray Coulter, homeowner, retired terrain logistics from the U.S. Army. I've been tracking slope movement for months. I sent warnings, multiple times. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. Did the HOA respond to those warnings? They issued me a fine, I said flatly. That caught on camera. Susan turned to the board members, who now looked like children caught cheating on a test. Randall tried to muster a response, but it came out shaky and defensive. We were following approved procedures, community development plans, and the weather was unforeseen. The forecast predicted rain for 10 straight days, I interrupted. And your own documents show you poured concrete on day 7. She turned back to me. Can we speak to you later for a full interview? I nodded once. Happy to. Randall staggered upright. This is not your jurisdiction, he hissed under his breath as he passed me. You've made this personal. I leaned in, eyes cold. No, Randall. You made this personal. I made it real. He didn't reply. The fire captain called for a temporary evacuation of homes closest to the slope, just to be safe. Several residents gathered at the roadblock, watching in stunned silence. I saw Eileen Marks holding a thermos, her lips pressed tight. When she caught my eye, she nodded, slowly, respectfully. That afternoon, county officials arrived on site. Sarah Malone was with them. She gave me a brief hug, then got to work. Her team used probes and ground-penetrating radar to map the full extent of the shift. By dusk, the verdict was in a 70-foot segment of the hillside had slipped. The worksite was now considered a red zone, too dangerous for further development, without deep structural reinforcement and drainage installation costing an estimated $400,000. And the HOA's insurance, unlikely to cover gross negligence. When the board reconvened that evening for an emergency session, and this time held not in the clubhouse, but in a borrowed city hall room under public scrutiny, Randall and Dana were visibly shaken. This time there was no smugness, no smirking, just silence, eyes downcast, as the city engineer outlined the failure points and assigned responsibility. I didn't speak at that meeting. I didn't need to. My work was done for now. But I couldn't help one last thought as I walked out into the misty night. They had ignored the land, mocked the science, dismissed the warnings. Then they drove in, and the land swallowed their pride whole. It didn't end with the first slide. The following morning, the neighborhood woke up to an eerie stillness. Not the calm kind that brings peace, but the heavy, suspended kind that warns of something unfinished. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a sky that looked bleached and pale, the air saturated and motionless. Scout stood at the window, growling, again his ears stiff. That low rumbling kind of growl he only used when something wasn't right in the distance. Haley noticed it too. "Is it over?" she asked. "I don't think so," I said, peering out through the mist. The main slope failed, but the pressure shifted. That means other parts are vulnerable now. At 9:13 a.m., my prediction proved itself sickeningly true. It started with a sharp snap wood splitting. Then the low deep groan of a living hillside wrenching apart. This time it wasn't just a scar opening. It was a full rupture. The upper ridge, where trees had stood for decades, gave way in one brutal sweep. Like dominoes tipping in slow motion, each root system failed, each layer of earth peeled downward, and the entire face of the hill lunged forward. I ran to the back deck just in time to see a wall of mud and debris, a 30-foot wave of black, oozing mass, consume everything in its path. There was screaming again. But this time, it wasn't just HOA members caught in the chaos. A local landscaping crew hired to remove debris from the previous day's collapse had returned to the site early, before any additional geotechnical orders had come in. They never should have been there. No one should have. But miscommunication, or maybe willful ignorance, brought them back. I could see one of the crewmen climbing onto the hood of his truck as the slide hit. The vehicle was caught halfway in the surge and twisted like a toy. Another man ran only to be knocked off his feet by a tumbling log. A third clung to the chain-link fence that had once outlined the site perimeter. I didn't think I moved. By the time I reached the slope, emergency responders were already scrambling to organize rescue. Sarah Malone was back shouting into a radio, her face pale. "This is a secondary event," she yelled. "Get search and rescue down here now." I pulled on gloves from my emergency kit and crossed the orange boundary line without waiting for permission. "Coulter," she called after me. "You can't. I know the topography better than anyone here," I shot back. "I'm going." Scout barked and followed. We reached the edge of the most unstable zone, mud, still shifting underfoot, small rocks and branches sliding like marbles. I spotted one of the landscapers half buried near the south end of the slab's remains, waving an arm weakly. "Hang on," I yelled. Another firefighter dropped beside me and helped dig. The mud was thick, full of broken roots and shattered lumber. My hands burned even through gloves. But we got him out, alive, shaken. One leg broken but breathing. Behind us, a second slide began, less severe, but enough to send more debris rushing down the hill. Everyone froze. I could hear Sarah on the radio again. "We need aerial extraction now. The slope's still active." They called in a rescue chopper. Not a life flight, just a local fire department bird equipped for difficult terrain. It hovered above the site within 15 minutes, sending wind and dust whipping in circles. A medic was lowered then, hoisted up the injured man. We pulled 2 more workers from the outer edge of the slide. One had a deep gash on his scalp, the other was borderline hypothermic from exposure and shock. The third crew member, the one who had been on the hood of the truck, we didn't find him until 4 hours later, alive under the collapsed truck bed, his ribs cracked, but his spirit somehow unbroken. When the last man was lifted into the ambulance, I finally stepped back. My legs shook, my back screamed, my lungs ached from the cold air and the effort. And yet a strange calm settled over me. Because the worst had happened and people had lived. Because for once I'd been there in time. Randall was there too, watching. Pale arms crossed, eyes glassy. Dana stood behind him, clutching her elbows, her body language defensive and small. Tom wasn't present. Word around the site was that he'd submitted a resignation earlier that morning. Randall approached as the last emergency truck rolled out. "I didn't know they were coming back," he said. "The landscapers. I told Dana to cancel them." I stared at him. Then why were they there? He didn't answer. I watched his gaze shift over the devastation, the trees stripped of bark, the heavy machinery mangled the slope, now resembling a battlefield. "They could have died," I said. "They still might if infection sets in, or if we missed someone. And if that happens, that's on you." His mouth trembled. "I never meant." "That's the thing about negligence," I cut in. "You don't have to mean it. You just have to ignore what's right in front of you." That afternoon, state officials arrived on site. They set up mobile offices. Drone teams flew over the ridge to map the full extent of displacement. County inspectors began filing reports. The term gross administrative failure appeared in more than one preliminary summary. The media had already made a meal of the story. By the 6 p.m. news, every local station led with footage of the slope tearing loose, aerial shots of the destruction, and interviews with the survivors. They even used a snippet of my statement from the day before. "If you think that's sabotage, you don't belong in charge of anything but a lawnmower." It was clipped dramatic, and judging by the response online, uncomfortably accurate. By nightfall, the entire worksite was declared off-limits. All construction projects by the HOA were suspended pending a full city audit. FEMA opened an investigation. Lawsuits began to trickle in from homeowners, contractors, even two of the injured workers. And still, the land wasn't done. At 11:42 p.m., a final section of the eastern ridge collapsed, not as violent as the others, but enough to bury what remained of Randall's precious slab under 6 feet of earth. It was gone now. The hill had taken back what it never gave permission to build, and in doing so, it left the truth exposed, raw, undeniable, and irreversible. By Sunday morning, Sycamore Ridge no longer resembled the carefully curated community featured in HOA pamphlets. The playground fences were draped in yellow caution tape. Sidewalks were blocked with plastic barriers, and HOA staff, those who hadn't already resigned, walked around looking like actors on the wrong stage, unsure where to stand now that the lights had turned hostile. The air was thick with diesel from emergency generators and the bitter smell of wet earth. The land had cracked open, but something else had too. The illusion of control the HOA had so desperately clung to. Rescue teams were still scouring the outskirts of the slide zone for any signs of delayed collapse. Geologists in hard hats poked long rods into the ground, speaking in technical phrases the board members couldn't begin to understand. Sarah Malone's team set up a portable command tent just outside the impact zone. I watched her direct efforts like a general, precise, confident, and tireless. She caught my eye between instructions and gave me a small, tired nod. Then came the wave of reporters. Not just local stations now, but regional affiliates. Seattle, Spokane, even one crew from California, drawn by viral footage of the hill swallowing construction equipment like candy. Clips of HOA officials fleeing through the mud had racked up tens of thousands of views online, set to dramatic music and titles like HOA ignored landslide warnings. Then this happened. It would have been funny if it hadn't come so close to being tragic. That morning, I agreed to an interview outside the perimeter by the back trail where I'd first noticed the tree lean weeks ago. The cameraman sat up under the skeletal canopy, adjusting the light. Susan Laramie stood in front of me, hair pulled back, boots caked with dried mud. "Mr. Coulter," she began, "you've become something of a symbol in all this. A homeowner warning of danger ignored until disaster struck. How does it feel now seeing what's happened?" I paused. "It feels hollow," I said. "I didn't want to be right. I wanted them to listen before it came to this. And what would you say to the HOA board now that the damage is done?" I looked into the lens. I'd say this leadership isn't about pretending to know everything. It's about listening to those who do. And when lives are at risk, arrogance becomes a weapon. The crew fell silent. Later that day, I received an official request to testify before the City Planning Council. The hearing was scheduled for Thursday, But the news spread quickly. Residents of Sycamore Ridge began organizing amongst themselves. Petitions circulated calling for a full HOA recall vote. In a neighborhood where no one used to speak out, there were suddenly yard signs reading, "Accountability over aesthetics. We deserve better." Thank you, Ray. I didn't ask for the recognition. I certainly didn't enjoy it. But it was better than silence. It was better than ignorance. That night, while reviewing the trail cam footage again frame by frame, I noticed something. At 4:09 a.m., just before the secondary slide, Randall Gibbs had been on site. Not during rescue. Not during cleanup. He'd driven up in a black SUV, stepped out with a flashlight, and walked directly to the control box, powering the slab's LED wiring. Then in the next frame, he was unplugging it and disappearing into the dark. No emergency report mentioned him being on site at that hour. I replayed the clip 3 times just to be sure. It was him. Mud-stained pants, that stupid windbreaker, and a look of panic, thinly veiled under determination. Why had he come back? And what had he hoped to fix or hide? I forwarded the footage to Sarah. Within the hour, she sent a one-line reply. We're opening an inquiry into unauthorized site interference. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was smoke. And in this situation, smoke was enough to get someone burned. Monday came and the HOA tried to do damage control. They released a formal statement crafted by lawyers, no doubt acknowledging unforeseen geological shifts, deep regret, and a commitment to greater transparency moving forward. Randall's name wasn't mentioned once. That same day, he resigned. No press conference, no apology. Just a 1-paragraph email circulated to HOA members at 4:17 p.m. Effective immediately. I am stepping down from the position of HOA president to allow Sycamore Ridge to begin the healing process. I am proud of what we built and hope the community continues to grow stronger together. What he built. It took all my restraint not to reply. Dana followed 2 hours later with a similar statement. Tom was already gone. The rest of the board remained in limbo, some clinging to what authority they thought they still had, others quietly packing their offices. The mayor's office issued a public letter thanking residents for their bravery and noting the importance of citizen engagement in the face of preventable disasters. FEMA allocated emergency assessment funding to stabilize the slope and construction on anything within 500 feet of the ridge was placed under a citywide moratorium pending geological inspection. I spent that evening walking the edge of the trail again. The rain had finally stopped. The air smelled like wet bark and broken roots. Scout trotted ahead of me, ears perked, more relaxed than he'd been in weeks. The trees, though still standing, creaked softly in the breeze. Nature still unpredictable, but momentarily calm. I stopped at the base of the trail where the alder had once stood, now a stump jutting from the muddy slope. A father and son walked past. The boy couldn't have been older than 8. He looked at me wide-eyed and whispered something to his dad. His father smiled. "That's the guy who saved everybody." I looked away. I didn't save everybody, but maybe I helped them save themselves. The land had given us its final warning, and it spoke in a voice too loud to ignore. Now it was up to all of us to listen. The subpoenas came faster than anyone expected. By Wednesday, 3 days after the final collapse, the Sycamore Ridge HOA was no longer just a neighborhood committee. It had become the subject of a formal investigation by the Washington State Attorney General's Office, the County Inspector General, and the Department of Environmental Quality. What had started as a landslide was rapidly turning into something far larger, a legal reckoning. I sat in my living room, Scout curled at my feet, watching the press conference on TV. Sarah Malone stood at the podium, flanked by city engineers and a FEMA representative. Her voice was even and unemotional, but the words were sharp. The slope behind Sycamore Ridge did not fail due to an unforeseeable act of nature. It failed because warnings were ignored, reports were suppressed, and proper procedures were abandoned in favor of expediency and vanity. She didn't name names. She didn't have to. That afternoon, I received an envelope by certified mail. Inside was a formal request for testimony under oath. The city wanted me to present everything I had: trail cam footage, emails, soil measurements, and first-hand accounts. I was ready. I had documented everything from the moment the crack first appeared behind my house to the final wave of destruction that buried the board's legacy in 6 feet of mud. The hearing took place in a tall, stark civic building downtown. The kind of place where everything echoes and the ceilings make you feel small. The city council chamber had been rearranged to accommodate not just the council itself, but also representatives from the state attorney's office, public safety board, and media outlets. I wore a gray blazer, no tie, just clean professional the way I'd shown up for court-martials and mission debriefings back in my military days. Haley offered to come, but I told her no. Some burdens a father bears alone. When they called my name, I walked up to the long table, took the oath, and sat. The lead investigator was a woman named Clarissa Denton, early 50s, sharp eyes, calm voice, zero tolerance for evasions. "Mr. Coulter," she began, "can you walk us through your first documented observation of soil instability near the HOA's construction site?" "Yes," I said. "December 28th, I recorded a shifting grade behind my property of 0.7 degrees over 48 hours. By January 2nd, that had increased to 1.9 degrees. She nodded. "And when did you first report this to the HOA?" "January 3rd. I submitted an email with photographic evidence and topographical data. No response. "And your warnings continued?" "Yes. I sent 5 formal notices, including one marked urgent, on January 13th, 24 hours before the initial collapse." She clicked a pen, and the board's response: "They fined me for obstruction." A few muffled gasps echoed behind me. Clarissa lifted a document. "Is this the warning report you submitted co-signed by Sarah Malone from the County Emergency Planning Office?" "It is." "And did anyone from the HOA acknowledge or act upon this warning before the incident?" "No." She let the silence stretch. Then she turned to the giant screen behind her and motioned to a technician. The trail cam footage rolled first the time-lapse of the alder tree leaning, then the slow widening of the soil fractures, then the first moment of collapse. The chamber was so quiet, you could hear the squeak of the projector adjusting focus. Then came the clip I'd forwarded, the one from 4:09 a.m., the morning of the second slide. Randall Gibbs walking up the trail in the dark. Alone. Flashlight. Tampering with the site's electrical system. Clarissa paused the video. "Can you confirm the identity of this individual?" "Randall Gibbs," I said. The technician zoomed in. It was blurry but unmistakable. Clarissa cleared her throat. This occurred approximately 3 hours before additional workers were caught in a secondary slide. "Did Mr. Gibbs notify emergency services or the county of his visit to the site?" "No." "Did he have clearance to be on the property during a designated hazard freeze?" "No." "And do you believe his presence at the site and potential interference with the equipment contributed to the timing or outcome of the second landslide?" I looked up. "I believe it was an attempt to manipulate or remove evidence." The room broke into murmurs. Randall wasn't present at the hearing. Neither was Dana. Their legal counsel had filed motions for delay, citing medical stress and personal threats, but the evidence was already out, and it spoke for itself. Later that week, charges were formally filed. Reckless endangerment felony, negligent oversight of public works, tampering with a hazard zone under investigation, suppression of safety warnings with intent to proceed. They wouldn't serve jail time. This wasn't that kind of case, but the civil penalties alone could bankrupt them. And the criminal record would follow them for the rest of their lives. By Friday, 5 of the 7 board members had officially resigned. One disappeared from public view, entirely moved out of the neighborhood in the dead of night, according to Eileen Marks, who lived across the street. The HOA, now rudderless and reviled, was placed under temporary city oversight, a rare and humiliating outcome. A new election was scheduled for the spring, and for the first time in the neighborhood's history, it was open to full public vote, without vetting or pre-approval by the old board. I was asked if I would run. I declined. My work wasn't to govern. It was to warn, to act, to stand firm when others bent. Haley and I took a walk that Saturday morning along the ridgeline. The land was scarred but settling. Temporary erosion barriers had been put up. Reforestation teams were coming in next month. FEMA would cover a portion of the damage, but homeowners would carry the rest. Still, people were planting new trees. Children had started riding bikes again. Neighbors waved at each other. Smiles were tentative, but real. The land would heal. So would we. As we stood near the site of the first slide, Haley took my hand and looked up at me. "You didn't just warn them, Dad. You saved them." I gave a slow nod. "Sometimes warnings are enough," I said. "Sometimes they aren't. But silence is never the answer." And then we walked home, feet muddy hearts, lighter heads held high in a place that had finally begun to listen. The first time I walked the ridge, after everything had settled, it was quiet in a way that felt earned. The scar of the landslide was still visible, of course raw dirt sliced open, like skin-exposed roots clinging to fractured soil. But around it, nature was beginning its slow, deliberate work. Moss had started to creep along the edges. A few stubborn shoots of grass dared to poke through the mud. And above it all, the trees that remained stood taller, more solemn, as if they were keeping watch. Now guardians over a lesson we nearly failed to learn. Scout trotted ahead, stopping every so often to sniff the air and check behind him. Haley walked beside me, hands in her jacket pockets, her gaze distant but peaceful. It was late spring, nearly 4 months after the slide, and the neighborhood had finally begun to look like a community again. Only this time it wasn't curated by glossy newsletters or HOA edicts. It was built by real conversation, mutual respect, and the sobering memory of what had nearly destroyed us. The Sycamore Ridge HOA no longer looked anything like it used to. After the mass resignations, the Emergency Oversight Committee had implemented sweeping changes, starting with term limits, transparent voting procedures, and a rule requiring third-party verification for all development proposals involving land use. They also revoked the misinformation clause they'd once used to fine me. Eileen Marks became the new president. She didn't want the job, but the neighborhood practically demanded it. She was pragmatic, calm, and most importantly, she listened. I sat with her the day before the final vote. "I'm not you, Ray," she'd said. "I don't have your background or training." "You don't need my background," I replied. "You just need to ask questions and not be afraid of the answers." She smiled then, that tired but brave smile I'd come to recognize as the true face of leadership. A few days later, she offered to name the new green space along the recovered slope after me. I declined. "Call it the listening field," I told her instead. "Let it stand as a reminder." And that's what they did. It wasn't a park, not yet. The ground still needed time. But they cleared the debris, stabilized the soil, and planted native wildflowers, ones that could grow strong without a lot of pampering, resilient, rooted, honest. The HOA's old clubhouse had been turned into a public resource center, a place where residents could attend workshops on land use, emergency planning, and even community mediation. Haley and I gave a talk there once, standing side by side, telling our story. People asked questions. They listened. And I could see in their eyes that something had shifted. Maybe it took the earth breaking loose to shake us all awake. The last time I saw Randall Gibbs, it was by chance. I was picking up sandbags from a county depot before the summer rains, and he was in line behind me, thinner, quieter, older somehow. He didn't make eye contact, and I didn't offer any. But as I turned to leave, he cleared his throat. "You were right," he said softly. I stopped. I wasn't trying to destroy anything, he added. I just wanted to leave something behind, a legacy. I looked at him, really looked. The sharpness was gone from his eyes, the arrogance too. All that remained was the hollow shell of a man who'd believed the position made him invincible. "You did leave something behind," I said. "A lesson. That's enough." He nodded and said nothing more. Back home, I placed the sandbags where the runoff from the top ridge still ran too close for comfort. Not out of fear, but habit. Haley brought me lemonade and sat beside me on the porch steps. "You ever think about moving?" she asked, her voice casual. I looked out over the land. "No," I said. "This place nearly broke apart." "But we didn't." She smiled. "You know, some of the kids at school think you're a legend. The landslide guy." One kid asked if you used to work for the CIA. I laughed. "Tell them I used to work for the dirt." She leaned against me, and we watched the sun dip behind the distant tree line, casting long golden shadows across what used to be the danger zone. Now it just looked like a place that had survived, like us. And that's what I hope people remember. Not just the collapse, but the standing, the refusal to stay quiet. The moment one voice backed by knowledge, steadied by experience, and sharpened by love for a place refused to be ignored. When no one listens, stand anyway. Because eventually someone will. Maybe not the people in power, maybe not right away. But the ground will speak, the truth will rise. And if you're still standing when it does, you'll be ready to help others do the same. That's the legacy I choose. Not a monument, not a title. Just one clear voice in the storm saying,